The bitter cold of the pre-dawn air tasted like burnt oil and fear. October 14th, 1943. Bassingbourn lay shrouded in a fog thick enough to choke a ghost, yet through the mist, the colossal silhouettes of the B-17 flying fortresses hummed with a malignant energy. This was not just another mission briefing. This was the reckoning. Lieutenant Jim Rhodes, gripping a thermos of lukewarm, bitter coffee, stared at the wall map, where a long, thin red line stabbed deep into the heart of Nazi Germany, culminating in a tiny dot labeled Schweinfurt. Rhodes was 22, but his eyes held the 1,000-yard stare of a man who had seen too much metal rip and too many friends vanish in smoke. The target was the Kugelfischer ball bearing plants. Without those bearings, Germany's tanks, U-boats, and most critically, their fighter engines would grind to a halt. The Joint Chiefs called it a surgical strike designed to sever the enemy's industrial arteries. The pilots, whispering in the chilled Nissen huts, simply called it suicide. They knew the intelligence reports were grim. The Luftwaffe had been waiting, regrouping, building an air defense network thicker and more savage than anything seen before. Just 5 weeks earlier, the first attempt on Schweinfurt had cost them 60 planes. Today, they were sending nearly 300 heavy bombers, flying beyond the effective range of their P-47 Thunderbolt escorts, a fatal, deliberate sacrifice necessary for the mission's length. As the crews boarded, the ground crews gave them looks of profound, silent pity. This was the moment the bravado died, replaced by a crystalline clarity of terror. Rhodes checked the oxygen gauge on Shack Up, his B-17G, named ironically after a disastrous poker game, and climbed into the pilot's seat. Below him, Navigator Major Bill Kincaid, a reserved man pushing 40, whose wife had written him a sealed letter to open only if he failed to return, checked his charts, confirming the coordinates for the deadly penetration. The engines caught, roaring to life, shaking the damp earth, a sound that promised both liberation and destruction. Rhodes looked across the packed formation on the taxiway, 300 Leviathans lumbering towards the runway, carrying 4,000 men, all knowing with sickening certainty that a quarter of them would not see the sunset. The sheer scale of the operation magnified the dread. There was safety in numbers, perhaps, but also a massive target profile. The control tower crackled. "Operationally, gentlemen, this is critical. Hold formation, maintain altitude, and Godspeed." Rhodes felt the words sink like lead in his stomach. They weren't asking them to fight. They were asking them to endure a slaughter. The climb to altitude was agonizingly slow, a monotonous exercise in maintaining tight formation in the dark. At 25,000 feet, the air thinned and the temperature plummeted to -40 degrees Celsius. Every man was now reliant on the thin, life-giving flow of oxygen, encased in heavy fleece and fighting the creeping numbness of frostbite. The formation, known as the Mighty Eighth, crossed the English Channel and sliced into the occupied Netherlands airspace. The sun finally broke through, illuminating the vast, shimmering armada, a majestic, terrifying sight of polished aluminum catching the pale morning light. This beauty was short-lived.
Kincaid called up, his voice slightly distorted by the mask. "Rhodes, we are 20 minutes from the point where the thunderbolts turn back. Brace yourselves." That 20-minute window felt like a lifetime. The P-47s, squat and powerful, suddenly peeled off, wagging their wings in a final, heartbreaking salute, leaving the bombers naked and exposed over enemy territory. It was the moment every bomber crew hated the most, the severing of the umbilical cord. Almost immediately, the German reaction began, not with fighter attacks, but with the angry, blossoming cotton puffs of flak, anti-aircraft fire, rising from coastal batteries. These bursts were the opening chorus of the Symphony of Hell. The first B-17 in the low squadron, Joker's Wild, took a direct hit to the tail section. The massive four-engined plane bucked violently. Then, impossibly, the entire tail assembly sheared off. For a fleeting second, the front half of the bomber hung suspended, a metal coffin, before spinning down in a flat, sickening corkscrew, carrying its crew, many still strapped inside, to the mud below. No parachutes, just gone. The sight was immediate and demoralizing, yet the grim discipline of the formation held. You couldn't stop, you couldn't deviate. Deviation meant isolation, and isolation meant guaranteed death. Rhodes keyed his microphone. "Gunners, listen up! They're hitting us hard and fast. Concentrate your fire, conserve your ammo, don't waste a single round." His voice was steady, masking the trembling in his hands. He watched the gaps in the formation open and close like rapidly healing wounds, the adjacent planes instinctively moving in to cover the space left by their fallen comrades, a chilling testament to their training and the brutal calculus of survival. The fighter escort was gone, the flak was rising, and somewhere, over the German heartland, the Messerschmitts and Focke-Wulfs were gathering like wolves drawn by the scent of a fresh kill. The true test of Black Thursday was just beginning.
The enemy arrived with a horrifying efficiency that belied the chaos of aerial combat. They were not stragglers, they were a coordinated, overwhelming force. Intelligence had underestimated the Luftwaffe's recovery speed and tactical innovation. Instead of chasing the bombers from behind, which allowed the B-17's heavy tail guns to inflict maximum damage, the Germans adopted the Rifleman approach. Massive squadrons of twin-engined Messerschmitt Bf-110s and heavy Focke-Wulf FW-190s attacked head-on, tearing through the formation's nose. A B-17's nose held the least armor and the most fragile instruments, manned primarily by the bombardier and navigator. The closing speed of two aircraft approaching at over 300 miles per hour was terrifying, leaving the gunners barely 3 seconds of firing time. The air became instantly saturated with tracers, bright, lethal lines of fire converging on the formation. Rhodes banked sharply, avoiding the debris of a B-17 that had just exploded directly in front of them, the detonation momentarily rocking Shack up violently. The shockwave felt like a giant fist striking the plane's fuselage. He glanced over his shoulder. The entire sky behind them was now a swirling mosaic of smoke trails and glistening fragments of aluminum. His bombardier, Sergeant Harris, screamed into the intercom, "3 110s, 11 o'clock, closing fast, they're stacking up!" The sound of the German cannon fire, heavy 20mm and 30mm shells, was distinct, not the rapid ripping sound of the American 50 caliber machine guns, but a heavy concussive thump, thump, thump as shells tore into the airframe. Shack-up shuddered as hits peppered the wings. The outboard engine on the right sputtered, coughed black smoke, and died, instantly tilting the fortress. Rhodes wrestled with the controls, fighting the torque and the rapidly increasing vulnerability. Losing an engine meant losing altitude and falling out of the protective cradle of the combat box, the worst possible fate. They were now dropping slightly below the main formation, forcing Rhodes to push the 3 remaining engines to their absolute limit. The radio exploded with frantic, overlapping communications, calls from medics, warnings about oxygen failure, and the terrifying silence of crews that had just vanished. This was the turning point of the mission. The moment the pilots understood they weren't engaging in a battle, they were merely trying to survive a massacre. The German fighters, utterly unafraid of the bombers' firepower, were pressing their advantage with maniacal zeal, tearing into the bomber stream repeatedly, reloading and returning for more. Rhodes wiped a bead of sweat that instantly froze on his oxygen mask. The sheer volume of incoming fire was numbing. They were now over the deepest sector of enemy territory, the penetration phase complete, but the main line of attack had yet to begin. The German defense commanders, having spent weeks plotting this response, held their most devastating reserves for this exact moment. The formations were already ragged, fractured by the sustained head-on assaults. Rhodes could see B-17s plummeting every few minutes, some burning fiercely, others spinning silently, their control surfaces mangled, becoming giant unguided lawn darts. The air was littered with the gruesome evidence of the battle. Parachutes, some open, some streaming uselessly, mixed with bits of propeller blades, shattered plexiglass, and unidentifiable organic matter. The gunners were operating on pure adrenaline and desperation. Sergeant Miller, in the waist section, reported his guns overheating, the barrel changing color from dull metal to a frightening cherry red. Kincaid, the navigator, attempted to plot a detour around a particularly heavy concentration of flak ahead, but Rhodes overruled him, knowing that deviating further from the prescribed track would only expose them to even fresher German interceptors patrolling the flanks. "We stick with the lead element, Bill. If we fall out, we die alone," Rhodes barked. The psychological strain was perhaps worse than the physical damage. Every man was forced to witness the agonizing, drawn-out deaths of dozens of their closest friends. The anonymity of the high-altitude fight dissolved into personal tragedy as they recognized the markings of B-17s they had eaten breakfast with just hours earlier. Rhodes watched Patriot's Kiss, a plane belonging to Lieutenant Sanders, who had just shown him a photo of his newborn daughter, suffer a crippling attack. Sanders managed to hold the plane level long enough for several shoots to deploy before the remaining German fighters descended, firing mercilessly into the silk canopies, a horrifying display of deliberate cruelty that shocked the American crews to the core. The German pilots, trained to break the morale of the attackers, knew exactly what they were doing. The combat was no longer about disabling targets, it was about psychological terror. Inside Shack-up, the lights flickered momentarily, the result of shredded electrical conduits near the radio compartment. The ball turret gunner, Corporal Taggart, suddenly went silent. The waist gunner checked back and reported that the turret was locked, Taggart unresponsive. They couldn't pull him out due to the damage. He was likely either dead or severely wounded, entombed in his plexiglass cage, 26,000 feet over Germany. Rhodes logged the loss, the routine action masking the icy punch in his gut. The death count was climbing faster than they could track, and they hadn't even reached the target yet. The mission was already proving to be far more costly than their highest projections.
Major Kincaid,
huddled over his flickering navigation table, felt the weight of the war pressing down on him. The map, usually a sterile, clean representation of geographical reality, was smeared with oil and what he suspected was blood, staining the critical lines marking their route. His primary compass was malfunctioning due to magnetic interference from the enemy's concentrated radar defense, forcing him to rely heavily on celestial navigation and visual checks of landmarks now obscured by ground haze and the rising pillars of smoke from bombed towns far below. The cumulative damage to the bomber stream meant that the lead navigators were fighting a losing battle against drift, turbulence, and the constant need to compensate for the loss of speed and altitude from the crippled planes around them. He yelled into the intercom, "Rhodes, we are running 10 degrees north of the plotted vector. Need a correction, port 3. Rhodes fought the heavy yoke, the control surfaces responding sluggishly. The plane was carrying too much ice and damage. They were entering the final approach corridor to Schweinfurt, and the fighter attacks had intensified into a sustained siege. The realization hit Kincaid with brutal force. They had flown 300 miles deep into the enemy's lair, losing over 50 planes, and the crucial decision of whether the destruction of the ball-bearing plant was worth this exponential sacrifice had to be made by every surviving pilot in the next few minutes. The mission's success was measured by the destruction on the ground, but the cost was measured in the shattered hulls falling from the sky. Kincaid knew the moral calculus was impossible, yet necessary. If they turned back now, the losses would have been for nothing. The men who had already died would have done so in vain. If they pressed on, the casualty rate would surely reach 30%, potentially crippling the 8th Air Force for months. This wasn't merely a tactical choice, it was an ethical and emotional abyss they were flying over. He caught Rhodes's eye in the rear-view mirror. The young pilot's face was grimy, drawn tight with focused intensity. Did the generals know it would be this bad? Did they calculate the loss of 60 planes for the strategic victory? Kincaid wondered. This was the moment the definition of courage changed from enduring fear to making a conscious decision to proceed into certain devastation for a strategic goal thousands of miles away. It requires a specific kind of internal strength, a denial of instinct. They were crossing an invisible line where the mission became paramount over individual survival. This intense, cold calculation, the idea that individual lives are acceptable collateral damage for a higher strategic aim, is a burden only those airmen could truly grasp. What do you, the viewer, think? If you were Major Kincaid, watching your comrades burn while carrying a secret letter from your wife, knowing that pushing forward means guaranteed horrific loss, could you, argue for turning back, or would the duty to the mission and your fallen comrades compel you to hit the target, regardless of the ultimate price? Share your thoughts on that impossible choice in the comments below. The question hung in the air, unanswered, as the flak ahead thickened into a solid, impenetrable wall of dark steel. The target area appeared not as a city, but as a cyclonic storm of black flak smoke. The ground defenses around Schweinfurt were legendary, a labyrinth of 88mm and 105mm anti-aircraft batteries positioned with deadly precision. After weathering the onslaught of the German fighters, the remaining bombers now had to fly straight into the inferno generated by the ground crews. The transition was immediate. The scream of the fighters was replaced by the concussive, ripping percussion of the heavy flak shells detonating all around them. The explosions were violent, deafening, and relentless. Unlike fighter attacks, which were focused and sporadic, The flak was an indiscriminate storm, enveloping the entire formation. Shack up was hammered repeatedly. The floor of the cockpit rattled like a snare drum as shrapnel tore through the aluminum skin. The smell of ozone and sulfur filled the cramped cabin, burning the eyes and throat. Rhodes felt a searing pain in his left shoulder. A piece of flying metal had ripped through his heavy jacket. He bit down hard, ignoring the pain, and focused solely on holding the bombing run altitude and speed. Kincaid, the navigator, transitioned to bombardier, peering through the bombsight, a task made nearly impossible by the plane's violent shuddering and the smoke obscuring the target below. "Steady, steady! I need 2 more seconds of stable flight, Jim!" Kincaid shouted, his voice strained. Rhodes pushed the yoke, fighting the air currents, the damage, and the sheer inertia of the massive plane. They were flying through a lethal blender. Suddenly, the entire nose section was bathed in a brilliant flash of red and white light as a flak burst detonated just 10 feet off the starboard wingtip. The plane lurched, throwing Rhodes against his restraints. The interphone crackled. "Ball turret is responding. Taggart is alive but pinned. We got a massive hole in the catwalk." Miraculously, the plane held together. Kincaid finally confirmed the alignment. "Bombs away! Bombs away!" The belly doors opened, and the heavy payload, 6,000 pounds of high explosives, tumbled out into the abyss, destined for the industrial heart of the target. There was a temporary subtle lift in the plane as the weight vanished, a weight that had been exchanged for the lives of the men flying it. Rhodes immediately slammed the plane into a hard turn, the designated breakout maneuver, desperate to escape the pinpoint accuracy of the ground batteries. The Schweinfurt target area was now erupting in secondary explosions, a clear sign that the mission, despite the horrendous cost, was succeeding in its destructive goal. But the most dangerous part of the mission was yet to come. The flight home, wounded, depleted, and low on fuel, back through the waiting wolves. The turn away from Schweinfurt unleashed a fresh wave of German aggression. The remaining Luftwaffe pilots, knowing the bombers were low on ammunition, damaged and psychologically spent, launched their final desperate attacks. This time the attacks came from all angles, delivered with an almost suicidal intensity. Shackup, limping badly on 3 engines, dropped further out of the main formation. Rhodes was bleeding steadily, and the hydraulic pressure was failing, making every control movement a Herculean effort. He was flying the massive bomber through pure muscle and instinct. The radio operator reported critical fuel loss in the number 1 tank, perforated by flak. They had perhaps an hour and a half of flying time left, and the English coast was 3 hours away at their current speed. The odds of survival had just plummeted from desperate to impossible. The gunners were silent now, either wounded, dead, or simply out of ammunition, their belts stripped bare. Rhodes realized that if another fighter attacked, they had almost no way to defend themselves, a terrifying vulnerability at 20,000 feet. He ordered the remaining crew to jettison anything that wasn't bolted down or critical to survival. Empty oxygen bottles, excess equipment, even the personal effects of the men who had bailed out or died, hoping to gain a few precious knots of speed and save fuel. Kincaid used the radio to broadcast a blind distress signal, hoping any Allied fighter patrol might hear them, knowing the chances were negligible. The sky was an endless expanse of hostile blue, devoid of any friendly presence. Looking back, the sight was profoundly sickening. The vast armada that had departed England was reduced to shattered fragments, small isolated groups of 2 or 3 struggling fortresses,
flying parallel to the ground in a grim procession of the damaged and the dying. The total disappearance of so many aircraft, whole squadrons wiped from the sky, underscored the scale of the defeat, even if the mission objective had been met. Rhodes looked out at the jagged tear in the wingtip, noting the structural fatigue. He knew a few more hits or even heavy turbulence could finish them. He started the mental calculation, ditching in the North Sea or attempting a crash landing in neutral Switzerland. Neither was appealing. Survival was no longer dependent on fighting prowess. It was dependent on the sheer structural integrity of the B-17, a testament to its famous durability, and the grim, stubborn refusal of the remaining crew to quit. The only solace was the knowledge that every mile they flew west was a mile closer to safety, and a mile further from the vengeful pursuit of the Reich's remaining air defense.
The casualties inside Shack Up demanded immediate, agonizing attention, despite the plane's critical condition. The tail gunner, Sergeant Donnelly, had taken shrapnel to the leg, tearing his artery. Without a dedicated medic, they were forced to rely on Corporal Taggart, miraculously retrieved from the damaged Ball turret and found to be suffering only from a concussion and severe shock, to apply a makeshift tourniquet under Kincaid's shouted instructions. The sheer effort of moving around the cramped, freezing fuselage at altitude was exhausting, consuming vital oxygen. The air smelled thick and metallic from spilled blood. Rhodes's wounded shoulder screamed with pain, but the adrenaline had numbed the worst of it. The remaining crew members, bone-weary and running on fumes, began stripping their damaged bomber to its bare essentials. The decision to throw out the dead crewman's equipment was brutal but necessary. They were flying on the absolute ragged edge, perpetually slipping into stalls, and the last functioning engine was running hot, vibrating furiously. They nursed every nautical mile, Rhodes constantly trimming the controls to keep the nose up, compensating for the lost wing lift. The radio operator, miraculously alive despite the shell hit to his compartment, managed to confirm the mission's horrific toll. At least 60 bombers confirmed destroyed, possibly more, with a further 17 badly damaged and written off upon return. Almost 600 airmen were dead or captured, a loss rate that shook the entire foundation of the American bombing strategy. This single day, Black Thursday, had effectively grounded the 8th Air Force's deep penetration missions for months. They had crippled Schweinfurt, but at the cost of crippling themselves. This internal realization was heavier than any physical damage. They had won a tactical victory, but suffered a strategic defeat in terms of manpower and morale. Rhodes fought the urge to close his eyes, the fatigue becoming hallucinatory. He saw phantom flashes of Flak and heard the imagined screams of falling comrades. Kincaid, however, found renewed focus in the sheer difficulty of his job. He was navigating by dead reckoning and sheer memory now, having lost several vital instruments. He plotted the line connecting them to safety, a thin, desperate thread pulled across hundreds of miles of hostile land, betting everything on the faintest hope of crossing the withdrawal zone at precisely the right moment to meet the returning fighter screen. The light began to fail, plunging the high altitude into the gloom of late afternoon. For 2 hours, Shack Up had flown alone, a crippled metal ghost traversing the vast emptiness. Rhodes had nearly convinced himself that they would either run out of fuel or be picked off by a patrolling fighter, accepting the inevitable with a dull, emotional numbness. Then Kincaid yelled, a sound of pure, unadulterated relief. "Rhodes, contact at 2 o'clock high! They're American! They're P-47s!" Rhodes squinted through the dirty, cracked windshield. 4 tiny specks were closing fast, too fast to be Messerschmitts. As they drew closer, the distinctive blunt profiles of the Republic P-47 Thunderbolts materialized, their silver paint glinting, utterly glorious, carrying the star and bar insignia of the U.S. Army Air Forces. These were the long-range patrols, flying far beyond their usual escort radius, desperately sweeping the withdrawal zones for stragglers like themselves. The arrival of the Jugs was not merely a military necessity, it was salvation. It was the physical manifestation of hope after hours of despair. One of the P-47s peeled off and flew alongside Shack-Up, the pilot waving enthusiastically, a young man who looked impossibly fresh compared to Rhodes' grime-streaked exhaustion. The emotional release was overwhelming. Rhodes felt the tension drain from his body, replaced by a profound wave of dizziness. They were safe from the vultures of the Luftwaffe. The P-47 settled into escort position, guiding the crippled fortress towards the coast. Kincaid managed to radio the rescue services in England, informing them of their critical status, wounded crew, and damaged hydraulics. The final leg of the journey was agonizingly slow, a constant battle against the wind and the failing engine. As they descended, the air warmed slightly and the pressure increased, a physical reminder that they were returning to the world of the living. Rhodes initiated the landing sequence, praying the landing gear would deploy, knowing that without hydraulic pressure, they would have to rely on the manual emergency crank, an exhausting and time-consuming process. The wheels dropped with a reassuring clunk, though they came down unevenly. The P-47s dipped their wings one final time as Rhodes lined up for the final approach to the nearest emergency field in East Anglia. He was bringing his men home. He looked back into the fuselage, seeing the injured, the shell-shocked, and the defiant glint in their eyes. They had faced the absolute worst the enemy could throw, watched their friends vaporize, and somehow, by sheer stubbornness and the grace of a durable aluminum tube, they had survived. The landing was a miracle of controlled chaos. With the hydraulics dead, the brakes were minimally functional, and the control flaps were useless. Rhodes executed a near-perfect belly-flop landing, guiding Shack-Up onto the grass alongside the runway, sacrificing the already ruined landing gear to minimize the impact on the fuselage. The plane slewed violently, throwing dust and dirt high into the air, finally grinding to a halt with a shuddering groan of tortured metal. The silence that followed was deafening, a vacuum after the hours of engine noise and cannon fire. Emergency crews, ambulances, and fire tenders converged instantly. Ground crew personnel, their faces etched with horror, rushed the plane. As the crew began tumbling out of the escape hatch, blinking against the floodlights, the ground crews saw the extent of the damage. The right outboard engine was a shredded mess. The tail section was peppered with hundreds of shell holes, and the waist section looked like it had been attacked by a giant can opener. The smell of high-octane fuel, cordite and copper, mixed sickeningly with the smell of sweat and blood. Rhodes was the last man out, dropping stiffly onto the cold, damp earth. He leaned against the landing gear, ignoring the medics who swarmed him, focusing instead on the sight of his crew, all alive, battered, but breathing. The silence of the base was unsettling. The flight line, usually bustling with activity as hundreds of planes returned, was sparsely populated. The empty parking spots spoke volumes more eloquently than any official casualty report. Seeing the empty spaces where 50 or 60 B-17s should have been was the final, brutal summation of the mission's cost.
He watched Major Kincaid, pale but composed, giving a concise report to an intelligence officer, his voice shaky but professional. They were heroes, yes, but they were also survivors, haunted by the specter of their lost comrades. The immediate euphoria of survival quickly curdled into the heavy weight of grief and survivor's guilt. Rhodes allowed a medic to finally clean and bandage his shoulder, the pain returning with a vengeance now that the adrenaline had fled. He looked back at Shack Up, the fortress now reduced to a derelict hulk, the name Shack Up barely visible beneath the grime and holes. It had brought them home, just barely. That night, the mess hall was quiet, the usual raucous celebrations replaced by a somber quietude. The men drank their rations of whiskey in silence, unable to meet each other's eyes, the ghosts of Black Thursday sitting heavily amongst them. The courage displayed that day was not in the fight, but in the decision to continue flying straight through the fire, knowing the price that would be exacted for the sake of the mission. They had succeeded in destroying the bearings plant, setting German production back months, but they had also written one of the bloodiest chapters in the history of strategic bombing, a sacrifice they would carry for the rest of their lives. That night, Rhodes lay awake, staring at the ceiling, the ghosts of the fallen circling endlessly at 26,000 feet, forever etched into the cold, silent sky over Schweinfurt, Germany. He knew, with absolute certainty, that he would fly again. That was the ultimate measure of their sacrifice and their resolve. The war demanded it, and the memory of their lost friends compelled it. This singular, horrific raid changed the entire calculus of the air war, proving that unescorted bombers could not survive deep penetration missions, forcing the immediate, prioritized deployment of true long-range escort fighters like the P-51 Mustang. The price of that lesson was paid in blood, metal, and the profound trauma carried by the men of the 8th Air Force. The story of Schweinfurt, of Black Thursday, is the definition of sustained, terrifying bravery in the face of annihilation. They did what they had to do, knowing it was likely the last thing they would ever do. The sun would rise again, but for the men of the 8th, the skies would never be quite the same. If this story of impossible courage and devastating sacrifice touched your heart, please subscribe to WWII Lore and join us in honoring the pilots who flew into the heart of the storm.